Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Liuba Ferrario and I am a policy officer on offshore renewable energy for Seas at Risk, which is a network of environmental NGOs working to protect and restore the ocean. Today we're here to discuss a very important, timely and complex topic, which is the end of life of offshore wind farms and different strategies, including decommissioning. Before we start diving into the discussion, I'd like to share just a few practical rules on the agenda and housekeeping. Just give me a second. I hope you can all see my screen. So today we will start with a short presentation of a report by Seas at Risk on the decommissioning of offshore wind farms. I'll be doing that in a moment, followed by a presentation from one of our speakers on the Belgian experience on the decommissioning of offshore wind farms, and continue with a panel discussion and a question and answer session with our speakers. For the Q&A session, please use the chat function, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can. And we will close this webinar at the latest at 4:15. Before moving on, I would like to briefly introduce our speakers. You'll have a chance to hear from them in a moment, but we'll have Nele de Splinter. She's a policy advisor on marine environment at the Belgian Federal Ministry for Health, Food Chain Safety and Environment. So she will be presenting the Belgian case, and she will also provide her perspective as a Belgian representative involved in the work of Offshore. We then have Gianmarco Gioffre, who is a sustainability advisor at Wind Europe, and Pien Summers, who is project manager for nature-friendly energy at the North Sea Foundation, a Dutch environmental NGO. So without further ado, let me introduce our work and what Seas at Risk has been doing on decommissioning. So as we all know in this webinar, offshore wind plays a central role in the transition to renewable energy, and we're seeing that now the first generation offshore wind farms are reaching the end of life, and this raises important questions from different perspectives. So we have the biodiversity protection and restoration, and here the challenge becomes even more pressing if we consider the degraded state of marine ecosystem and their urgent need for restoration and protection. We then have the objective of decarbonisation and the achievement of the transition to renewable energy. So these considerations on end of life become really important when it comes to effectively managing existing offshore wind farms and, for example, avoiding that well-functioning offshore wind farms are then dismantled due to, for example, legal constraint or the expiration of concessions. And then last but not least, considerations on resource efficiently material use reduction and the need to transition to a circular economy. So with the discussion picking up on decommissioning in many countries, but also in the Offshore Commission, which is an initiative by 15 governments to protect the Northeast Atlantic, the Offshore Commission starting to discuss these the topic of decommissioning and potentially presenting guidelines on the topic. We've decided as Seas at Risk to commission a report to a Dutch consultancy called Profundo to look into this topic and the knowledge available on different end-of-life approaches and their environmental impact as well as their policies. So what you can find is indeed the different options that are available at the end of life and the available knowledge on their environmental impacts, the policies that they're relevant. So this is at the international level, at the European level, and in some cases at the national level too. And finally, lessons learned from oil and gas decommissioning given that many of the international frameworks and policies have been developed with oil and gas in mind, and that OSPAR itself has a decision on oil and gas, we thought it'd be relevant to look into this. You will find also so the geographical scope is EU, UK, and Norway, but you will find a case studies on Denmark and the UK, and the technological scope is bottom fixed offshore wind. You can find the report on our website, and also it will be, or has already been linked in the chat. I'm gonna see because I'm sharing. Briefly, before I summarize the policy recommendations that we have compiled, just something that we found out when it comes to definitions is that we try to group different approaches into three, let's say, categories. One that we've identified as pre-decommissioning stage, which includes lifetime extension, repowering. Obviously, repowering, it really, there's very little experience offshore, but it also really depends what type of repowering, because full repowering could even require full decommissioning before. Then we have the decommissioning stage, which includes full removal and partial removal with different options in these categories. And then what we identified as complementary strategies, which include repurposing and reuse of components, as well as recycling. So with this analysis, we then put forward a number of recommendations, starting from an overarching assessment that, due to the site-specific characteristic of the different habitats, the technical features that differ depending on the offshore wind farm, and the remaining knowledge gaps, to which I will get in a moment, we recommend that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and that a case-by-case approach should be adopted and should be centered on robust data based on not only environmental impact assessments, but also robust monitoring. As to complement this overarching recommendation, we suggest a number of actions. The first one is to strengthen and harmonize monitoring at the basin level. Monitoring is not only critical if we use environmental impact assessments to take a screenshot of what is happening and how the ecosystem is around an offshore wind farm, monitoring really does give us more of a longer term perspective where we can better understand how ecosystems have developed around the offshore wind farm over time. So this is absolutely central for end of life decisions, and also should be harmonized at international level to make sure that they're harmonized minimum standard across countries. A second recommendation is, I mentioned earlier, the knowledge gaps. So a second recommendation relates to improving research. This concerns not only research on the impacts that different versions, for example, of full and partial removal have, or repowering, but also really research into what is the ecological value of ecosystems that have developed around offshore wind farms, and what is the ecological value of different nature inclusive design measures. In connection to this, it's also important to make sure that the topic of decommissioning enters and it's taken into account into the discussion around cumulative impact assessments. There are several fora working on methods on cumulative impact assessment, but for also obvious challenges related to data scarcity, decommissioning is sometimes overlooked or more of a challenging element to consider. Another action concerns embedding and really including end-of-life considerations more into the planning phase. So this can take different forms, but it's really important that maritime spatial planning is also taking a central role when it comes to end-of-life decisions, and that, for instance, we make more use of already existing location rather than introducing more infrastructure whenever that makes sense and whenever there's no significant environmental impact. And in this context, we also identified cross-border cooperation as a key element, because it really enables to have a more holistic approach to the energy and generation and demand, and to balance both, and ultimately looking at making sure that the infrastructure installed in European waters is not, it's within the carrying capacity of marine ecosystems. Similarly, this is more of a planning recommendation in complement to that. There's also an element of introducing circularity and end-of-life consideration more in the design of offshore wind farms. And we've had our report also looks at the tool of non-price criteria, which so far have been, there have been some good examples in some countries around the North Sea already considering circularity, but there is quite some potential there to use them, for example, to facilitate reuse of certain components or to mandate the use of recycled material. Another element is, if our overarching recommendation is to make sure that decommissioning decisions are taken based on ecological criteria, and therefore the whole rationale is to make sure that the impact on marine ecosystem is as minimal as possible, and that certain ecosystems that have developed over time or adapted over time are preserved, then there should be a discussion on what should be the status of areas in cases where partial removal is chosen as an option. This means basically ensuring that the areas are protected and not subject to further human pressures. Here, there's also obviously an element of clearly defining the roles and liabilities for the infrastructure left in place, which is one of the key topics discussed when it comes to decommissioning with partial removal. And last but not least, when we looked at different international frameworks and EU legislation, we found that there's really quite a few pieces of legislation that are relevant for the end of life of offshore wind farms. It can be, for example, the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, the Environmental Liability Directive, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. There really is quite a long list. However, its application in the case of the decommissioning and end-of-life stage is not necessarily that clear. So we believe that both national authorities, but also wind operators and wind developers and environmental NGOs could really benefit from having more guidance on how this should be applied, and to make sure that the application is more harmonized across borders. So thank you very much. This is a brief introduction and setting the scene from our report, and I will now give the floor to one of our speakers, Nele de Splenter, who will give us concrete insights from the Belgian case.
Yes, thank you, Luba, for inviting me, for having the opportunity to present a Belgian case. So thank you, Seas at Risk, for organizing this, and especially Luba and Helen for making sure that everything works fine and we're able to share presentations and communicate easily. So thank you very much. My name is indeed Nele de Splenter. I work for the Federal Public Service Health, especially the Marine Environment Department. And a few years back, we created a Belgian vision on offshore wind decommissioning. Can you see the presentation? Yes, okay, then I will proceed on explaining a bit the Belgian situation. So you can see with the blue delineation dots the Belgian part of the North Sea, with on our eastern part, or on the eastern side of the Belgian area, we have 9 different wind farms that have been commissioned between 2009 and 2020. This means now that the first decommissioning is foreseen in 2034, but it is possible that the permit that will expire first will be extended. So it could go to 2039. So we're not focusing now on extension of permitting or repowering. We are focusing on decommissioning. And as the installation of these wind farms in 2009 especially was pioneering work, the decommissioning, will be the same. We need new insights, we need scientific research, we need innovative techniques to be able to decommission to the best possible, with the best possible outcome. So in Belgium, it was considered very important to have a timely vision created on decommissioning so we could develop an efficient policy. And on the initiative of the Belgian Minister of North Sea, we initiated a stakeholder consultation. We is the Federal Public Service Health, together with the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Science. So this already makes it clear that we had the policy side present at the stakeholder consultation and also the scientific community. But you can see that we had 39 different organizations attending this stakeholder consultation, the biggest part coming from the industry, but also there we had very different people attending the meetings coming from wind farm, well, some of them were wind farm developers, some of them operators. We had marine contractors, energy companies, consulting agencies, engineering firms, port, sand extractors, and fisheries. So a very broad representation. And we all kicked off in October 2022 with this stakeholder consultation. We had 4 active working group meetings to discuss content, which led up to a report that was presented at a final event in May 2023. So we worked for about 6 months on the development of this vision, and it ended up with a final report that was published in June 23. I will share with you the link on the last slide of this presentation, and this presentation will be shared with you through Seas at Risk. So thank you also for that, Seas at Risk. Why did we have a stakeholder consultation? Well, we found a dialogue to be very important. We wanted to have a better understanding of the different views, but also the different concerns, to be able to early detect potential obstacles and conflicting interests so we could address these obstacles, which then made it possible to build a consensus. Because if you have a consensus, then you will have a result that is more broadly supported, and the stakeholders will acknowledge ownership of that result, which then again facilitates implementation and increases the possibility of a good result. We had different decommissioning options, but we also encountered a few limitations. We, as previously explained, had commissioned wind farms, 9 of them, but we also have an area, the Princess Elizabeth area, that still needs to be developed. The tender procedure needs to be started, so there's no permit yet. And this Princess Elizabeth area is largely in Natura 2000 area, so a protected area, which makes a huge difference between the still to be developed area and our existing 9 wind farms in the Eastern Energy Zone. There, of course, will be a link with repowering, but as previously mentioned, we will not touch upon the full subject of end of life, but we will keep it limited to decommissioning. And in Belgian waters, we have 3 different foundation types. You can see them on the picture there. We have 6 gravity-based foundations in the sea power wind farm. We have 49 jacket foundations, 48 of them being in sea power and 1 in Belwind. And we have 344 monopiles, which makes the bigger part of our foundation. And that was why we decided to focus on these monopiles before expanding our assessment to all monopiles, and also have a conclusion on how this should coexist with repowering in the Princess Elizabeth area. Looking at our different options, we divided it into the options for monopiles and masts, which gave us 5 different options. Option M1, where we only remove the blades, rotor, and nacelle. Option M2, there the mast is cut off as well up until the transition piece. Option M3, there the monopile is cut off 3 meters above the seabed. Option M4, the cutoff is 2 meters below the seabed. And option M5 is full removal. For the erosion protection layer and the inter-array cables, we only have 2 options. Either it remains or it is removed. But of course, it might be something in between there as well. But we kept it as 2 options, so remain or remove. We assessed all these options from different perspectives. You can see them listed here, and I will go through them one by one. The first assessment was based from the point of view of nature conservation and recovery/restoration, where we noticed that there was a developed new nature in these wind farms because of the artificial reef effect coming from the hard substrate that was introduced in that environment. This is not a naturally occurring biodiversity at that location. So we did have some questions on the value of this new nature, and there was a lot of discussion on the value of this nature. So this is something that still has not been clarified fully, so we need to do some scientific research on that topic. In these dynamic sandbanks, this biodiversity has a good resistance towards this disruption, which means that if we will repower and reintroduce hard substrate, it will lead to a rapid recovery of this new ecosystem. So leaving hard substrate in place is not ideal. It's not necessary, because we will have the same ecosystem in a few years after repowering, which will in all likeliness be the case in our Eastern Energy Zone. Also, safety-wise, if you leave less infrastructure behind, then you will have a lower risk for navigation, a lower financial risk, a lower risk for new uses of that same area, it being wind energy or anything else. You will lower the risk. You will also, if you take out all structures, you will no longer have negative long-term effects on the ecosystem, on the biodiversity, because you will no longer have a possibility of leaching, of corrosion, or paint flakes that end up in the marine environment and that have an impact on these species. It's also better for circularity. We can reuse very valuable materials. If you cut off 2 meters below the sea, if you cut off the monopile, for instance, 2 meters below the seabed, then you leave more than 50% of highly valuable steel behind. This is not in line with the self-sufficiency aim of the EU. So we should keep that in mind and make sure that we reuse as much materials as we can. From an administrative and legal perspective, you have existing legislation. Luba already mentioned a few of them. A few other ones are, for instance, the polluter pays principle. There are indeed a few, well, how do you say it? Within OSPAR, there are a few decisions, guidelines, and recommendations. So we consider them as legislative frameworks as well. We have Belgian law with the Marine Environment Act, and of course we have permits where it is mentioned that the environment should be restored to its original state. There's one exception in the permitting, the environmental permit of the Belgian wind farms, that says that the monopiles could be cut off 2 meters below the seabed. So we need to clarify that, of course, for the operators to make sure that they know where they stand and what they need to do. And as Luba also mentioned, liability is a key issue that needs to be addressed. The technology is improving very rapidly. New technologies are emerging, existing technologies are improving. So there's a very, very rapid improvements there. And of course, you have the financial aspect, where we found it very plausible that partial removal will only be a very short-term cost saving for the current operators. But the long-term costs are very, well, we have a lot of question marks with the costs on the long term. And as well, when you leave structure behind, there is a risk that costs will be transferred to maybe new developers, new users of that area, but also to the government and to society. And that is something that should not be the case. So if we conclude on the different decommissioning options, these were the original options. We being the majority of stakeholders, was in favor of a reset scenario where all structures that were introduced by developers are being removed from the marine environment again. It must be said that we had two very big points of attention with this conclusion, one being the technical and financial feasibility of full removal of the monopile foundations, and maybe also the other foundation, but definitely for the monopile foundations, but also for the erosion protection layer. It's very unlikely that you can ever remove 100% of these rocks. And another point of attention was that even when you take out the erosion protection layer with the intention to reuse it in a newly developed wind farm, it will be very, very expensive and time consuming. That is why we kept a few more options open. For the monopile, we also keep open option M4, which is the cutoff 2 meters below the seabed. And for the erosion protection layer, we are also looking at how erosion protection could be left behind, but we need further research on that. We need consultation on a national level and on an international level on the feasibility, advantages, disadvantages of these alternative dismantling scenarios. And of course, we have the different foundation, but in our assessment, we had similar results. For the jackets, it's even a little bit easier because you have no erosion protection layer there. And of course, you will need other removal techniques, but we thought that also the reset scenario there is the preferred option. You can see a few of the technical specifications on these foundations, specifically for this wind farm, if you want to compare this with your installations, that's possible. And the last slide, for future wind farms, we have two options. We have the Princess Elizabeth Zone, which will be the first new to develop area, which is overlapping for a big part with the Vlaamse Banken. This is Natura 2000 area where we have gravel beds that naturally occur, and we have a very rich biodiversity in that area. So we should limit the disturbance of this rich naturally occurring habitat and biodiversity. And this is in contrast with the aim to design for full removal, while we will probably consider it a bit more to leaving cables and erosion protection layers partially in place in that area to protect the gravel beds, the very rich gravel beds. When we will look at repowering of the Eastern Energy Zone, you will still have the dynamic sandbanks there that are that encounter a lot of disturbance, and there's a very how do you say it, not rich, but poor biodiversity over there. So we explained it previously. I'm not going into that again. This is definitely an area where full removal will be the default option. So you can find the report of 2023 in 3 languages, in Dutch, French, and English, on our website and through the link on this slide. And if you would like to ask some more questions, you have my contact details over there. Thank you, Luba, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Nele, for this very interesting presentation. I think it shows quite well how complex of a decision it is and how many factors play in it, and also how different areas between each other with different features may require different approaches. We had a deep dive in the Belgian case. We'll soon hear more about the Netherlands, but first I would like to ask you, Gianmarco, you're here on behalf of Wind Europe. So if you could give us a little bit more detail on Wind Europe's perspective on decommissioning, and also any specific challenges that you find when it comes to decommissioning offshore compared to onshore, for example.
Well, thank you, Yuba, and also thank you, for the very interesting presentation that we've just seen with the colleague Nele. So I think there are, we could take 3 hours to answer this question because it's been the product of let's say the topic of offshore decommissioning arose relatively recently. I would say like one year and a half ago, it became really like more and more on top of the, let's say, the agenda from at least from the sustainability side of things for obvious reasons. The first one being that we're at the moment already decommissioning much offshore. We do have some sort of anecdotal examples, some sort of small projects here and there with very old wind turbines or very small. So that's one of the things. But let's say if we want to have, for the whole audience here of the panel, I think the first answer is, what's our view? We have a position paper that came out at the end of the summer. It's on the whole topic of decommissioning. Therefore, it includes both onshore and offshore decommissioning. And so let's say the overall view is there of, let's say, how the industry is looking at this problem, although it's still in a way narrowed to a specific part of the conversation, which I would call, let's say, a bit higher level. We didn't go into the very technical details on how practically decommission should be performed, also because it's not really a technical document, but it's more a way for the industry to say also what we expect and what we think it's the best, what should come in the coming years, which is very much aligned also with what you were presenting before on a few key points. I would say the key word here is definitely flexibility, in the sense of having an approach that allows developers, so those ones, operators, so the ones that are eventually responsible for the end of life decision making, to look at the site-specific circumstances. So really, each wind farm is different, each seabed is different, each turbine model can differ from the neighboring wind farm that maybe has different models and therefore different components, etc. So I think this is a key point. And then to maybe a connection. So the position paper I said before is covering both onshore and offshore, but they are two different beasts, really different. Possibly under many aspects. I would say the first one is total different operational experience. Onshore is way older, so we do have a lot of history there. So we do have examples of decommissioning. Even then, it's not that much because we will be seeing the biggest amounts, so volumes of decommissioning in the coming, I would say, 5 years. But yeah, of course, there is more experience there. So we do have a playbook. Then the difference is in scale, let's say in size, I would say. So wind turbines offshore are way bigger than onshore. So we're talking about different objects, literally with a different interaction with the environment around them. They occupy very broad spaces there. So there are definitely lots of differences. Different stakeholders involved. Offshore players, let's say, are not necessarily the same ones that we see onshore, and of course that opens a lot of other topics and discussions. And then again, the key difference, if we want to talk about decommissioning specifically, well, it's that timing matters. So let's say that at the moment it's more urgent to look at the onshore problems, but the offshore ones are going to be so big in a way in terms of again, size, scale, and everything, that it's actually now it's the moment. It's really the key let's say the key period when we can really do something about this. But of course, again, where do we do something? You were mentioning before, which are the key institutions. The European Union, to a certain extent, can support us there, and then we have international bodies that can also do their part with guidance, etc. But again, as you also mentioned, enforcement and say harmonized implementation is really key here. Otherwise, we'd really see legislation applied in different ways in different parts of Europe. Yeah, I guess this answered the question, but again, we would need a lot more time to elaborate, but this is to give a glimpse.
Thank you so much, Gianmarco. Yeah, I think we're going to struggle today with the limited time to discuss such a complex topic. Yeah, I already have a lot of questions, but thank you for clarifying. And indeed, it's quite important differences. It also made me think that one thing is also, of course, to decommission existing offshore wind farms, but there's a lot of considerations that can be embedded in the early stages in the planning phase. So it's also useful to have this discussion now for the future offshore wind farms, given the volumes that we are expecting. I also know that you will have to go at some point before the end of the webinar. So I'll make sure that, and also this to the audience, if anybody has specific questions for Gianmarco, I'm happy to then put them in touch and follow up. Now I'd like to jump back to look at the specific country and ask our third speaker, Pim Sommers, about his work in the Dutch Initiative for Nature-Friendly Decommissioning and the situation in the Netherlands with decommissioning of offshore wind farms.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Really nice and important topic to discuss today. So for the Dutch context, I think the discussions are also only just starting. We see that there's the two oldest offshore wind farms that were planned to be decommissioned in 2027 and 2028. Both applied for lifetime extension. One already got the extended permit, and the other, I think, is still in the process of getting it. But it will likely be both be extended. So still there's some time, but it is coming. And it's coming quick. And obviously this is just the start, as Gianmarco and also Nele said, there's the scale of which decommissioning will need to happen in the future is immense. So we really need to talk about it now. And I think also for the Dutch case, we see that within offshore wind tenders, we've seen that non-price criteria are also used also to promote ecological measures, so nature enhancement measures within offshore wind farms. For instance, the Ecowende farm, but also the Noordzeker wind farm, they both were tenders that really focused on the ecological potential of these, the nature enhancement potential within these wind farms. And currently also these nature enhancement measures fall within the same permit. So under current legislation need to be decommissioned at end of life together with the whole wind farm. So that I think is really one of the key drivers of the discussion in the Netherlands as well. We are promoting these nature enhancing measures, but what does happen with them at the end of life? So that's really also one of the driving. So next to the first decommissioning approaching. There's also with these newer wind farms a discussion, how do we handle these nature enhancement measures that we have implemented? And that's also a topic that initiated, I think, the Dutch initiative that I'm part of. So it's the Nature-Friendly Decommissioning project. It was initiated more on the oil and gas side, so mainly on oil and gas platforms. How do they enhance nature values, and what is the ecological potential of those platforms, and how can we think about them, and how can we retain as much of this ecological potential? And then quickly after, we also we're looking into the offshore wind decommissioning, and then mainly starting from this nature inclusive design perspective, and really thinking, well, there's a lot of effort that we put in to make it more nature friendly, but it should also be nature friendly at the end of life. So that's really within this project we are looking together with industry, both on oil and gas and on the wind industry side, how can we, well, assess this ecological value within these assets in order to decide or inform decision makers when is there enough ecological value to consider partial decommissioning. So with our work, we're not making the decisions. We're not setting a limit. This is ecologically valuable enough, because that's really well, not up to us. I think there's a lot of debate on this topic, but it's more a guideline to start the conversation and to really discuss. Well, there is ecological potential, and then approach it case by case, which is already mentioned multiple times, fortunately. So I think that's really the approach of the project as well. We need a case by case approach in order to see whether there's ecological potential to be retained through partial decommissioning. And that's currently we really are looking into on the policy side of the discussion. So we started on the Dutch policy side. So there's interdepartmental discussions within the Dutch government on the obligation of offshore wind decommissioning. But they are now also waiting on some expert reports, but also trying to align a bit better with the OSPAR process that is just starting up. So they don't want to make decisive conclusions before OSPAR. They know a bit more about what direction OSPAR is going. So also the Dutch policy contact is now a bit slowing down and really trying to align more to the OSPAR discussions. So now also with our project, we are trying to better align to this international level of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Wim. A lot of important elements there. Indeed, the link with nature inclusive design and stimulating also investment in that, but then understanding what to do at the end. And also thanks so much for making the link with oil and gas. And I think it's very useful that your project looks at both. We'll be asking also in a moment, Nelly, a bit more about OSPAR. I just thought maybe I can briefly ask Gianmarco one more question before you have to leave. Because we've talked about the different elements. I think Nele's slides showed very well what type of dimensions are considered and factors are considered in offshore wind decommissioning. So we have, for example, impacts on marine biodiversity, but obviously we have impacts related to material use. And I guess sometimes it can also be that the two implied, like a choice could imply trade-off also between different dimensions. I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about WindEurope's work and key priorities on this element on circularity and resource reduction, especially in connection with other policies coming up at the EU level.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. This is definitely a key point, which again opens another Pandora box of possible other considerations. I think there is one key point that I would like to emphasize even before going into the circular economy or the other, let's say, possible key considerations, which is I've been going around quite a lot, speaking at different panel discussions, conferences to talk about this topic, and I've realized more and more how probably the key message that I often bring at the table is a big question mark. But it's let's say an informed question mark in the sense that unfortunately it is very, very difficult today to let's say take one way and think that that's the way to go, in the sense of when we look at scientific evidence of both approaches, so either leaving things behind or removing everything, First of all, we don't really understand what we talk about in terms of definition. There is an issue with semantics that is quite relevant. Really, one of the hardest part of writing the position paper was keeping all the members, like finding an agreement around the definition of full and partial removal. And already there, the conversation can take different, let's say, ways. So that's one thing. The other thing is, for as much as we do have scientific evidence that is, telling us what's, the benefit for the biodiversity of leaving things behind, we also have examples of the opposite. Or we don't have enough in general, pieces of information to have a very strongly informed, to have a strongly informed decision-making process at the end of life. This doesn't mean that we can't choose. It definitely means that we need to consider all the possible scenarios there. And that's when you mention now circularity. Well, circularity is essential. I mean, it's definitely an element that must be taken into account, especially when you have that. I also have those conversations not only with wind turbine manufacturers or project developers, but I also do talk to, for instance, foundation manufacturers or all the colleagues of the cables industry, and of course there you hear different opinions, let's say. So also there, maybe to a certain extent, for instance, the high need for high quality steel would suggest us to remove the whole thing, all the foundations. And then I talk to certain developers who are telling me that at current state of the art in a specific part of UK, full removal is technically impossible. Literally, all the companies are pulling out, saying, no, we can't actually do this. In other parts, like in Belgium, we do have players that instead are telling us that this is possible. So I don't want to bring confusion. I just want to show that there is such a colorful situation at the moment that the real answer here is compromise. And how to do the compromise? Well, then, looking at all those values, again, you mentioned, so we have biodiversity and let's say and ecosystem considerations, we have resource use and circularity. We do have a very important one, which is technical feasibility and safety. Let's remember that removing enormous wind turbines in an offshore scenario, it is quite of a challenging exercise. We're talking about practically like gigantic structures of steel and composite material. And then, of course, the future use and the public interest part. So looking at so again, circularity must be sort of, weighted together with these other relevant key considerations. And I think at the moment, it's very difficult for me which one I don't give an order of priority because simply there isn't. In a certain situation, one is really, really more important than the other. So I probably went a bit outside of the scope of the answer, but I think it's really essential here to show that everyone is doing a great effort from an NGO perspective, from the industry as well, and from the, let's say, public authority. The reality is that the biggest call we can do is a call for monitoring, a call for maybe having some, support from states to have those pilot projects of full removal to really see whether that is doable and what are the long-term effects. Again, we were talking about, for instance, the pollutant in the sea of leaving maybe part of the structure there. We do also have studies that prove exactly the opposite. And so this tension, I think, is really important. And that's where I think also policymakers should start doing their work. So very happy to participate in the decommissioning task force, where I think all the voices will be heard there. I'm talking about the OSPAR group. So let's see what happens there. But I think it's going to be a really exciting year. Also looking at, and this is a closing point, the geopolitical situation, which is very, very, very important. It could be like the fifth consideration, which is on top of everything, we need to consider where we import things from, which are the key stakeholders, and I mean, something that we can't really forget about it. And you were also there at Eolis at our annual event on end of life. And we also had an intervention from someone working in the Chinese Recycling Association, basically. And those problems also exist there. So let's keep an eye to also what's happening outside of Europe, because this is a broader conversation.
Thank you so much, Gianmarco. And I think you've really managed to capture the complexity. And indeed, I think until we also have enough information, we really need to find a way of making these decisions and weighing the different dimensions. And I think this also, you mentioned OSPAR yourself, but it really provides a good bridge to my next question that I would like to address to Nele, which is precisely on OSPAR's work. Because I mentioned at the beginning, you're here on behalf of Belgium, and Belgium is a contracting party in OSPAR. Which is now kicking off the work to possibly develop guidance on the decommissioning of offshore wind farms. So I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about Offshore's work on this and the role you play in the process.
Thank you, Luba. I first want to come back to the point that Gianmarco made, that it is very important that we put all stakeholders around the table, that we listen to each other, that we learn from each other and build on valuable experiences that are already there. So we should definitely have everybody around the table. And that is also why we started the work at OSPAR, actually to have a level playing field for all offshore wind operators, well, not only the operators, but everybody involved in offshore wind development. We also want to pursue economies of scale to make it easier for everybody, to make it financially feasible when technical advancements are necessary. And that is why we actually initiated the work at OSPAR, because if Belgium was the only one that would say you have to get everything out, you have to fully remove your structure, then it would not be financially feasible for our industry, for the Belgian operators to decommission fully. So that is why we wanted to look at it from a larger perspective, on a bigger scale, on a basin level, a European level, and OSPAR seemed the perfect fit for that, as this is indeed a group where you have 15 contracting parties and the Commission present to specifically work on the protection of the marine environment and to strategize, to harmonize policy. So this was the perfect fit. And specifically ICG ORIT, which is the Intersessional Correspondence Group on Offshore Renewable Energy Development, they have listed the development of such a common approach as one of their priority actions. So we developed a task template that was submitted to OSPAR, to ICG ORIT, a task on the decommissioning of offshore renewable energy installations. This was not approved, so we needed to limit the scope a bit, and we limited it to offshore wind decommissioning, which was then approved. So now this is a task within the Northeast Atlantic Environmental Strategy, and together with Sweden, we started working on this task that was approved in June 25. We had a workshop in October with about 60 people there to discuss on what is happening, what policy is already there, what policy is being developed now, what national working practices are existing, what about previous decommissioning projects? Can you share some information on that? What about the regulatory framework? So this was what we discussed about, and then we also try to identify the key issues that will need to be discussed when developing the actual approach. And tomorrow, actually, we are sitting together with the task group. So Luba, you will be there as well, Gianmarco, also, to decide on how we will organize a stakeholder consultation, because Gianmarco said it, I previously mentioned it, we need to have a sit down with everybody that has that expertise. So we really need to listen to these stakeholders, and it wasn't possible to all have them around the table at the starting workshop in October, but we will definitely need to listen to these experts and to build on their expertise. So this is something that we will decide on tomorrow, hopefully. And we will also establish a draft, a group that will draft the document. This document will probably have several revisions within this smaller task group, and then within the bigger task group, and also within the whole hierarchy of OSPAR, because there are a lot of steps to take when you want to approve a certain document. One important step will be to consult with JL. These are the jurists and linguists within OSPAR, and they will help decide what kind of legal status such a document can get. Will it be a guideline? You mentioned it a few times, to develop a guideline, but we're actually not sure if it's going to be a guideline or a recommendation or a decision. And this has there's a difference in the binding nature of such a document. So JL will be definitely an important group to consult with, and we hope to finalize our common approach by 2027. So fingers crossed that we will get there. And to come back to finish off, I will come back on something that Ben mentions. He's waiting, or the Netherlands is waiting on what is happening in OSPAR. It's good that you find it very important that OSPAR is working on this, and that you will look at what OSPAR is doing. But it would be very good to work together, so the Netherlands can do some work on decommissioning, but also the other contracting parties can do some work, maybe even the Commission, who is also represented at OSPAR within ICG Audit and who was present in the workshop. They could do some work, and to combine all that work to learn from each other, that will be very important. So please do not stay still until the OSPAR common approach is there, but let's try and work together.
Thank you so much, Nele, and also for picking up on what Gianmarco and Pim were mentioning. I think you've done a good job of explaining also how complex it is and how maybe sometimes also lengthy these processes can be. But obviously, all the speakers have mentioned the added value of having a cross-border approach and cross-border conversation, but also bringing all the stakeholders to the table. But obviously, that also requires more complex processes and time. I wanted to make a link. So you've mentioned what the task group has done so far and what is looking at. And obviously one of the sectors on which OSPAR has experience is oil and gas. And there is a decision from OSPAR on oil and gas decommissioning. I'm now turning to Pim. I know your work also focuses, as you mentioned before, on oil and gas. So I was just wondering if you can share anything that you learned from your project on the difference and similarities between offshore wind and oil and gas, and also what implications they may have when it comes to developing guidelines on decommissioning. I see, Gianmarco,
yes.
you're leaving. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, everyone. And you can reach out. I mean, I guess you can share my contact, and
Okay.
in case of any question, please let me know. Okay,
Thank
and
you
check
so much.
the position paper. You will find everything on our website.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Gianmarco.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a nice day.
For the question, Yuba. First of all, responding to Nele, I think we definitely got. I was speaking from also the ABO perspective. Obviously, the contracting party of the Netherlands, the ministries will work together with OSPAR, and I'm not speaking for them. So they will definitely work together. But the making the decisions, maybe that will take some more time now. But on the oil and gas side, we have also have it within our scope of the project, and we now see that it's because of legislation and also regulatory differences between the two, that we are now considering it more as two separate. Completely separate streams, because obviously you have OSPAR decision 98.3 that demands the obligation for full removal of disused installations, and that's mainly binding for oil and gas, and that's why obviously the work the task force on renewables is starting, because they do not directly fall under this decision. But I think we can learn something from this experience that obviously with the 98.3 you have some derogations for safety reasons on different weights or different materials. There can be there are exceptions made to leave them behind because of safety reasons. But that could also be a way of looking at it for the renewables. You can also look into what kind of derogations would you want for renewables, because obviously there needs to be room for flexibility in a case-by-case approach. But so maybe derogations is a way of including this flexibility. But how do we then inform that? So already in this the way of how it's set up, I think we can learn of how it works legally. We can also take it as a basis, but also start completely new. So it's really an experience that we can leverage, I think, as a whole OSPAR contracting parties. But also within the Netherlands, I think for the oil and gas, you see obviously examples outside of Europe, outside of the Netherlands, that have shown the potential of rigs to reef. So really embracing this partial decommissioning, repurposing it as a reef. But that's it's not possible under 98.3. But I think for the liability structures or for these types of things, there's things that we can learn from the Gulf of Mexico or Malaysia, how they approach this liability question. But still, I don't think that there will be much room to incorporate more flexibility on oil and gas. But within the Netherlands, there was earlier this year, there was a parliamentary motion adopted that urges the government to look into the ecological value of oil and gas installations in the Dutch North Sea. And that's so only looking into the ecological value and not really saying much about decommissioning, but obviously there's a link there. And I think this parliamentary motion is also, I hope it kicks off because it was adopted, I think, already half a year ago, but there's not been a lot of action on taking it on. We had elections also recently, so there's a risk that it will disappear and there's no real action taken. Because I think still that's also the link between oil and gas and renewables is learning from these ecological values and these assessments and these studies on ecology around infrastructure, even though these oil and gas installations are mainly jackets, and as Nele also showed, there's not a lot of jackets compared to monopiles. So there obviously complexity-wise, there are a lot of differences, but still there are lessons to be learned. And I think there's also been amazing work done by the Insight program in the UK, which really looks into these these ecological considerations around oil and gas installations. How is the ecological connectivity? What are the risks of pollution from plastics in building parts of the infrastructure? So there's a lot of work done, and they are also now starting up a new phase, and they are also starting a new program, VALMAS, the value of marine artificial structures. So I think leveraging all of this work done on oil and gas also should be taken up within the discussions in renewable energy to really leverage all of the work done and all of the knowledge that we already have, because I think we do not start at zero. There's already a lot of knowledge there, but also still, as mentioned before, a lot of knowledge gaps that we need to fill. So a lot to do, but I think the main link that we should make is really studying this ecological value between the two.
Thank you so much, Pim. Already some concrete ideas for Ospr's work and reflecting on whether derogations is a good way to address the flexibility that was discussed today. But also, yeah, interesting in a way that oil and gas there's a lot of technical differences, but the sector has had to ask itself similar questions. So there's definitely learnings there, and centering decisions also around the ecological aspect is perhaps a learning. As mentioned by Gianmarco, we could stay here for hours to talk about this, but I'm conscious of time. So I already saw there's 2 questions, and feel free, this is for the audience, if you have any others to write them in the chat now as well. I will just take briefly one that was directed to CZ Risk, because that's just faster, and then I will I see, Nele, there is a question for you. So there was a question on why CZ Risk is pushing the ecology and biodiversity angle still too hard, and that there are other important factors such as technical safety, economics. I just wanted to mention that obviously it was mentioned by many speakers here, that there are several dimensions, and it's important to have all stakeholders at the table. And this is also why we look forward to the work in OSPAR. We are a member organization, and our members have expertise on biodiversity. So obviously, this is the element on which we bring our voice to the table. But we are happy to engage in processes like OSPAR, indeed, to make sure that all considerations are brought to the table of policymakers. An informed decision can be made taking into account these different factors. On Nele, there was a specific question to your slide, which is, according to you, what is the key evidence required to justify deviations from the reset scenarios that you presented? E1 and E2 for the sky protection layer, and monopile for M4 and M5 for offshore wind farms. I don't know if it helps you, if you want to share again, or if you can just take it like this.
I can take it like this, and I can actually take both questions together, because they are, I think, linked to each other. So you have to look at it from the Belgian perspective, where we are looking at decommissioning at the earliest in 2034. So we still have about 10 years, a decade to make it happen. That's actually what we are, what we agreed on. We have 10 years, so we have to promote this technical advancement that makes it possible to fully remove all structures with a minimal impact on the environment, and of course with a minimal risk for the people who will take everything out, because this is definitely one of the things that we need to take into consideration, that the risks cannot be too high for the people who carry out the work at sea. That's also something that we learned from Decision 98/3, although not applicable to offshore wind. It is indeed one of the lessons that we can learn from the oil and gas industry. And that's also why I stress out the importance to maybe be a bit naive and start from a point where the full removal scenario might be the best one, because then you will create an incentive. And that was one of the problems with Decision 98/3. That's one of the reasons why it was reviewed last year, because the harmonized comparative assessment methodology that is used for Decision 98/3 was biased towards partial removal. And that is also why there was a lack of incentive for the industry to go towards this technical improvement, because that gave the opportunity to ask a derogation. And that is something that we really need to learn from, and maybe be naive and think it will be possible in a decade to fully remove and to go towards that goal, and see in a few years, is it now technically and financially feasible to remove all these structures with a minimal impact on the environment, with minimal risks for the people who carry out this work. So that is also why we kept the different scenarios on the scour protection and the monopile open, because if it is not possible with a minimalization of risk, then you should be able to grant a derogation of full removal to stay within the terminology of oil and gas.
Thank you so much, Nele, for clarifying this. I see that there are no more questions. I'll give just one more minute, but maybe if... yes, I see you unmute yourself, yeah.
Yeah, no, I reflecting on what Nele said about, really incentivizing full removal at the start and be naive. I think that is a way of doing it, but I think indeed promoting innovation towards low impact decommissioning, so that is both nature friendly but also serves circularity, is, I think, the way to go to look at a standard. But how to do that with the flexibility of this case-by-case approach, I'm not sure how that would be, what the best starting point would be from my perspective. But I'm a bit hesitant to say to incentivize this full removal, because I favor more I think the flexibility of the case-by-case approach is for me more important. But obviously, that's a different perspective. But I think we have a shared vision in that we want to drive innovation towards full decommissioning that has less impact. And then, for instance, you can leave scour protection or nature-inclusive design measures behind when they're proven ecologically valuable, but at least for instance, the steel for the monopiles or the foundations, to drive the innovation that we can regain as much materials for full circularity, but also create the least amount of impact on the environment. I think that is what everybody wants, and I think that we should work towards. Whether it be a guidelines or a decision or a recommendation, at least something that creates the incentive to drive this innovation towards low impact techniques. I think that serves everyone.
Thank you so much, Pim. Already, I think it shows what the different perspective could be at the table, but how maybe, finding also a joint objective can help then look more into the details. And I think adding to what you said, it's an element that you brought to the discussion earlier. Obviously, there's also the question of nature-inclusive design measures, right? And sending a certain signal of what is done at the end of life then also has a repercussion on incentives that throughout the operational lifetime or in the design phase, probably even more measures that can be taken to minimize the impacts on nature. But I see that we're almost at the end. I just wanted to wrap it up and thank you first of both very much for your presentations and input. I think it really shows the timeliness of the discussion and also the timeliness of OSPAR's work on this. The keyword, I guess, will be compromise, and also perhaps how to balance this flexibility with also the objectives of making sure that these decommissioning strategies have the smallest environmental impact, be it on marine ecosystems or also in terms of material reduction, but also, of course, that the assets and existing offshore wind farms are used in a way that maximizes our chances to get to the renewable energy targets that we've set and to our decarbonisation goals. So with this, I would like to thank you again, and also thank the audience for being here. As Nele mentioned, I will share the presentations in an email, and you can find our report there, but I will also follow up with this in an email and share with you Wind Europe's position paper that was mentioned by Gianmarco. And yes, stay tuned, because OSPAR will now kick off the work. I think all the speakers and will be working on this with their individual projects and organizations. So there will be more coming from our side to share with you. Thank you again, and yeah, have a nice afternoon.
Thank you very much for organizing.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.